frogs. Dorothy, the waitress at the Dolphin, the restaurant across the street from Mrs. Duncan's rooming house, refilled Will's coffee cup, then Robert's. Will had taken the first flat he looked at in Toronto, a small attic in a red brick house close to the lake in the West End. It had a bed frame with box springs and a mattress, linen, one wool blanket, a pillow, and a writing desk. The floor was covered with a worn shag carpet, and the ceiling slanted down on both sides. There was one square window that had no screen and pushed open like a door. Will could stick his head out and look down to the lake. He loved the room the moment he saw it. The downsides were the bathroom and the kitchen. They both stank. The bathroom of urine because the toilet was temperamental about flushing, and the kitchen of coffee grounds and bananas. He didn't mind the smell of coffee, but the bananas bothered him. Mrs. Duncan was an aged woman who, like the toilet, was temperamental. Upon greeting him on her doorstep, she had ushered him into the ground floor parlor and served him tea and shortbread cookies. She detailed her rental policies to him. There were 2 rooms for rent, leaving 5 empty. 7 boarders would be much too much for her. 2 kept her in tea and biscuits. All prospective tenants had to be clean and neat, which she could tell, she said, upon meeting them. There were to be no overnight guests, and, before concluding, she made a brief reference to her dead husband, 10 years gone of a heart attack. Damn cigarettes. Which brought her to her final and most adamant point. No smoking in the house. Will agreed and gave her 2 months' rent on the spot, even though he smoked just under a pack a day. He figured if she couldn't smell the smoke on his clothes, it couldn't be that serious a request. Robert Polsky was Will's only friend in Parkdale. He looked about 45, but it was impossible to tell his age for sure. Robert lived on the street a good part of his time, even though he had a room at the Gladstone Hotel. He just used it as an address, a place to pick up his disability benefits check. Robert saw a social worker once a week to make sure he was coping. He had wandered over to Will's booth at the Dolphin one morning and just started conversing. His first question was, "Do you want to buy these?" He was holding out a bottle of his prescription pills. Will read the label. It said Zolfax. Then Robert added that he was schizophrenic. No, Will said, "but I would like to buy you breakfast." And that was how the two became friends, in the short 3 or 4 weeks that Will had been in Toronto. "Are you still fasting?" "I am," Will answered. "But you drink coffee when you fast?" "I do. It has no calories. There's just the accelerant and the diuretic. I have to be careful, though. Too much coffee and I could dehydrate myself." Robert nodded. He had a Bible under his arm. Robert liked to read the Bible. It was early, near 7:30 a.m. Will was getting up very early, which was unusual for him. He would take a shower in the foul-smelling bathroom, which was more bearable if he opened the window a crack, despite the chill of the spring mornings. Then he would tiptoe down the stairs, open the creaky front door slowly, and slip out onto the cracked sidewalk. He was always careful to be quiet because he didn't want to change Mrs. Duncan's sterling first impression of him. The sidewalk led to a footpath by the train tracks beside Lakeshore Boulevard. The footpath took him to a pedestrian bridge. The bridge went over Lakeshore Boulevard and into the park by the lake. He'd walk along the lake for 15 minutes or an hour, depending on his mood and the weather. He had no contact with his former life, his parents, his friends from university. He broke his silence only for his sister in New York, who worked at the council on foreign relations. He let her know that he was all right and that he wanted to be alone for a while, to think some things through. He knew the message would get back to his parents in Ottawa. He felt a little guilty and cowardly for not contacting them directly. But the thought of his father's likely response to a time out in his life, his career path, even his acceptance into a law school, frightened Will. The irony of his situation was that he was living on a credit card loaned to him by his parents. His autonomy was a kind of irony in itself. He had done very little other than just loaf around and read books and lie on his bed and stare at the ceiling. He was like a prisoner, a self-incarcerated prisoner. It was hard for him to define what exactly happened to him in Ottawa, what spurred this move to Toronto, this move to isolation and deep introspection. There was the fast in Ottawa, that surely started it, but something else was pushing it now. Something else was moving it forward. It did not strike him as odd that the only person he talked to was a diagnosed schizophrenic, but there weren't a whole lot of people to meet in the community. The whole place seemed a little bit off. And then Will figured out that a large percentage of the population in the community was on an outpatient program with the mental health center smack dab in the middle of Parkdale. He could just be himself with Robert. Schizophrenics were very non-judgmental. He started their morning banter with a query. What did you say a prophet was, Robert? A prophet is someone who can guide and see. Yes, guide and see. I think that's it. Yes, guide and see. Will provoked him a little bit. What does that mean? Someone who can guide is someone who really understands. Another little push. Understands what? What we are. People. What people are. And the person who understands can see. Will flipped his Toronto Sun newspaper up and started to read. His relationship with Robert Polsky endorsed complete honesty of expression. It wasn't rude to have a newspaper between himself and Robert while they were talking. Robert just talked on behind the paper. He knew when to set it down and look at Robert. But what is he trying to see, the prophet? Is there a scope other than the microscope and the telescope? Can they see things our eyes can't see? Robert nodded his head a few times, deeply thinking. It's a kind of lens they've developed, the way I'm leaning. There is something there. They all see the same thing. That we're not alone, that there's something here with us. It loves us. It has no weight. Even light has weight. The problem with understanding the prophets is that their formulas use unknown variables, like love. It has no measurable qualities. Some lens they develop is the way I'm leaning. Will looked over the bend of the newspaper when Robert stopped talking. He was astounded with the answer. Remember when the yen fell, he asked. Robert looked blankly at Will. The yen, Will said, the Japanese currency. Oh yes, yen, Robert said. Remember when it was devaluated, when the Japanese economy imploded? Right, Robert said. Right. I read about that. They keep their money at home or in post offices, the Japanese. Right, Will said. Anyway, he went on, I think that's going to start happening a lot more. What? Robert asked. Sudden devaluations of national currency. Will sipped his coffee. Have you ever thought about the totality of it all, Robert? Robert looked dumbfounded for a moment. All what? The way we live. These vicious money summits where tens of thousands of people show up to kick in windows and smash heads with cops. Where's the chaos coming from? Robert shook his head, like he was trying to shake some fleas. It's a separate investigation, he said. It's a separate investigation. I guess, Will said, and he flipped the edge of his paper back up. Some cop got beat up a few blocks away last week. He's off duty and recovering at home. Says his jaw was broken in 3 places. Will referenced from the Toronto Sun. Indians got him, Robert said. Indians got him. Will made no sense of the statement. Sometimes Robert could go off in spaces Will couldn't follow. Will pointed to Robert's Bible. Do you believe in the miracles, Robert? I don't know. It's a separate study. Maybe Moses knew when the Red Sea would recede, enough for them to cross. Maybe Moses was a geophysicist. Natural sciences. Geophysics. Will nodded. So, he said, miracles might be undocumented science then. Great insights without formula. Maybe a little like that, Robert said. A little like that. The actual Bible is a fool's game. A fool's game. It could go on and on forever. It's chaos. A prophet could see and know. But where do they come from, Robert? What distinguishes them? Are we missing prophets because it's a simple case of misunderstanding? I mean, are prophets circumstantial? Are there certain circumstances that make them come into the world? Will put the paper down and leaned over the table. I mean, come on, think about it. There are parts of the rainforest in Costa Rica that have unique species based on a 10-foot difference in sea level. They have certain frogs and insects that only evolved to accommodate the specific moisture and consistent temperature of a specific altitude. If you go 10 feet higher or 10 feet lower, these life forms, they can't survive. I mean, are prophets like that? Are they dependent on certain conditions in our environment, our economy, either really bad or really good, but nowhere in between? I'm trying to ask you here, Robert, if you've really thought about prophets. Astrology, Robert said. What? Will said. Astrology might be time's map, the map of time, bigger clocks, the stars and the planets. It might be a map of time. And if it's a map of time, then you can break it down like seasons. And then you can, maybe you can know when the prophets bloom, or maybe when they get seeded. If the universe gets seeded with only so many prophets, then maybe they're like frogs in the imagination. Frogs die when the environment is too polluted because they breathe through their skin. Possibly, Will said. Dorothy walked up to the side of the booth with Robert's breakfast. Now you see, she said, looking at Will and pointing to the floor. That's why we don't like him in here. Will looked to the floor. There was a puddle of urine at Robert's feet. He got excited, conversing sometimes. And Will suspected his medication made him incontinent. Oh, he'll be fine, Will said. He smiled at Dorothy. He had a bit of latitude because he tipped well. But if it were not for Will, Robert wouldn't even be let through the front door. Fred says you have to have something to eat or you can't keep getting refills on your coffee. This one will be the last then, Will said. He held up his cup and smiled at Dorothy, who spun and walked away with the coffee pot. When she was out of earshot, Will turned to Robert and said, "Economists are the misbegotten progeny of prophets. Think about it." Robert's mouth hung open in bewilderment, a piece of egg falling to the plate. A large man appeared in front of their booth with a black duffel bag over his shoulder. "You guys want smokes?" he asked. Will inquired the price, then bought a carton. It was an unbeatable price. The man wrote down his name, Cobb, and a cell phone number on a napkin, and told Will to call him any time he needed cigarettes. When Cobb left, Robert said, "That's my neighbor at the Gladstone." End of chapter.